What is going on, everyone? So in this week's video, we're going to talk about focus stacking large format film, which is something you probably haven't heard too much about in the past. I'm sure you've probably heard of focus stacking, which is a technique where you take multiple photos of the exact same scene but focus differently throughout the scene, and then you use kind of Photoshop to put those together and you get a photo that has everything in focus. This is a technique that's been used for a very long time, especially with digital, where there's certain scenes you just can't get everything in focus. It's just not physically possible. You can't stop that aperture down far enough, or maybe you want to use a little bit of a sharper part of the lens. Well, with large format, we don't typically have to do that because we can use all sorts of other techniques, one of which is called front tilt. So if you imagine that this right here is the front of the camera, the lens pointing that way, back of the camera over here, you can take the front standard and kind of tilt it downward a little bit like this. And what happens when you do that is you take your plane of focus and it kind of drops down at an angle. And this is very useful for taking pictures in like desert scenes or anywhere where you have just kind of these long planes that kind of go off into the distance. Because that plane of focus, as it drops down, is going to connect the foreground to the background. And then when you stop down the lens a little bit, it kind of opens into a wedge. And that wedge is going to capture your foreground plane all the way out to like the mountains off in the distance. This works incredibly well and it's really easy to do on a large format camera, but it's not going to work if you're in a forest or if you're a scene where you have these strong verticals that are going to connect the foreground all the way up to the top of the photo. Because then what's going to happen is your plane of focus is going to slice right through that strong vertical, and that tree is going to get really blurry at the top. And even the slightest amount of tilt is going to ruin that photo. So when I was in the redwoods on my spring trip, there was a particular scene that I wanted to kind of experiment with doing a focus stack to kind of see what I could learn. And there's definitely some stuff I kind of learned in the process. And it's definitely a technique that I'll probably use in the future because otherwise it's very, very difficult to photograph in those forests. For those of you that don't know, large format film has an incredibly narrow depth of field, like incredibly narrow. And usually the most I like stopping down is about f/45. And I'm going to show you some photos here of what that actually translates to and how shallow the depth of field is. And then we're going to look at the kind of focus stack I did. I'm going to tell you right now, the photo we're going to look at, it is not a good photo. So it's not a photo I'm proud of. It's kind of more of just a little bit of an experiment to see how well the focus stacking works. So let's load up Photoshop here. And I'm going to be using Photoshop CS6. I also have the more recent version on here, but I'm a little better with CS6 for this kind of stuff. So I have the two scans of the image kind of overlapping over each other, and you'll see exactly kind of how they look here. So as I flip between them, and I have them labeled here, close focus is the top layer, and if I turn that off, we're looking at the far focus. And I'm going to zoom in here. So we are in the far focus right now. We're going to see that those trees in the background are definitely nice and sharp. If I kind of go down to the foreground, you can see it gets pretty blurry pretty fast, and the foreground tree here is not in focus. If I switch to the close focus, our foreground tree looks great. Just a little shy of the foreground is kind of how much our depth of field is going to be. So kind of just a little bit in front of those ferns, all the way out to about that tree. Then back behind that tree, it's definitely going to get pretty blurry pretty fast. And then when you look off into the background, you can see how blurry this really is. Now this is f/45, and this is focused about a third of the way into the scene, maybe a little bit, maybe not quite a third of the way, but typically that's the technique you do, focus a third of the way in, stop down, but you can see that I still have a really narrow depth of field. If we look at the far focus shot again, you can see how much better that really is. So if I zoom back out here, I want you guys to notice something. So if we look at the close focus versus the far focus, and you see that there's a pretty big framing difference between these two photos. And honestly, this was a little bit of a surprise to me. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense because a large format camera, when you focus it, you're kind of moving the front and rear standard kind of either closer or further from each other. It kind of acts as a little bit of a zoom. Now this is different than the way it's going to work with a lens on a mirrorless camera or on a DSLR, where typically the framing doesn't change that much. It might change a little bit, but it's not going to change as dramatically as this right here changed. So if you ever are going to be doing a large format focus stack, you definitely want to frame it with the closer focus framing in mind as opposed to the far focus, because otherwise you're going to have a little bit of a surprise when you have to crop in on the photo. So that's the first thing that I really learned here. So if we select both layers here, we go to edit, we go to auto align layers. Just gonna let it do its magic here. Basically, I'm gonna have it align these two photos so that everything kind of matches up perfectly. And this is the first step of doing the stacked image here. The other thing I learned is that if I do this technique in the future, I'm probably gonna wanna use 3 photos because there's some areas that are kind of in between where it's not quite covered by either of them. All right, so here is the end result of doing the auto align. And you can see how Photoshop did a pretty darn good job aligning those images so that when we do the focus stack, it's gonna have a lot better information to work with. So again, you can see the line here that represents how much the framing is gonna change. So definitely you're gonna wanna compose based on the close focus. All right, so now that we have these 2 images, I'm gonna go to edit. I'm going to auto blend layers, stack images, I'm gonna click OK, kind of let it do its thing. And right now it's gonna analyze the image, it's gonna look for the sharpest part of each photo and kind of create a custom mask to sort of incorporate both of the images. Now it doesn't look too much different here just looking at the photo, but you can see how this is the parts that it shows for one image, and then this is the area it shows for the other. So it actually did a pretty good job, though I'd probably go through and kind of fine tune the mask a little bit there. But now, if we zoom in, and this is 200% here, you'll see that we have our nice sharp background there, and then all the way into a nice sharp foreground. So I was able to handle it in 2 photos quite well, but I think 3 might give a little bit more flexibility, especially on some of the edges. Like right here, it's not quite in focus, but it's actually pretty decent. So that is what I learned from the process. You want to compose based on your close focus. Probably 3 photos would be a little bit better, but it's definitely a valid technique when it comes to large format for the scenes like this, where using all of the sort of the camera movements won't help at all, and otherwise I'd just end up having a really, really shallow depth of field. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next week.